What's up again, everybody? This past weekend, Roll for the North, the online version of Canadian Nationals, occurred. Roll for the North was a 5-round Swiss tournament with 50-minute best-of-3 rounds and no top cut. The tournament was put on by the wonderful DM North crew. You can check out all of their really great coverage over at dm-north.com. The prizing was stellar and the competition was really high. I mean, this is like the top of the top that we can get right now in the COVID landscape. It can't get much more competitive than this, and the 30 participants that came and played were all extremely skilled. So let's take a look at some of the general tournament data to see what kind of teams and what kind of cards really made the cut when it came to the competitive meta of Dice Masters. Before we do that, though, if you like this content and if you like Dice Masters or any other content that I produce on this channel, please feel free to like and subscribe. That helps me a ton, and it helps get this out there to the world at large. The more people that watch and comment and subscribe means the more people that see Dice Masters content. We are currently sitting at 1,845 subscribers, and we're shooting for that 1,850 subscriber mark. So if you want to help out, feel free to hit the like and the subscribe on this video. Okay, so before we go any further into analyzing the teams and the cards that really made the cut within the meta of this tournament, we should talk about the meta at large and what we've seen in previous tournaments. And to do that, we need to go all the way back to the late June time frame and to the EarthX Origins Roll Some Thunder event put on by the guys over at Rollin' Thunder. This was sort of a makeup for the US Nationals. And going into this event, many of us all expected a Becky Lynch team to kind of take the top spot and really dominate the entire field, showing us why it is the #1 card and sort of archetype within the meta. But instead we got a Godcatcher team in the form of Tuba2K7's Godcatcher team, where he used Godcatcher and Under Surveillance to push unblockable Godcatchers. And this really established this 2-horse race mentality going through into the rest of the summer. That was until mid-August when we had the release of the Infinity Gauntlet set, and that set did bring us new tools, new control pieces, and new win conditions into the mix. That brings us to late August when we had the next very large-scale tournament, which was put on by the Ministry of Dice, and this was the Ministry of Dice's UK Games Expo tournament. And in that tournament, we did see the introduction of some very powerful Infinity Gauntlet pieces, notably the Rare Collector, which was included on 13 different teams, the Rare Drax, which was included on 12 teams, the Rare Spider-Man, which was included on 9 teams. And as far as win conditions go, the top 2 win conditions that were present were actually the Godcatcher with 9 representations on teams, and the new super rare Thor with 7 representation on teams, though sometimes it didn't actually play a winning win condition role because it does have a wonderful global. Becky Lynch did drop in numbers with only 5 players running the Maiden Ireland variant and 2 players running the 4-drop Overcrush Becky Lynch. I should also mention there was 1 person running the Becky Lynch the Man, which is a really interesting card. But nevertheless, in that tournament, we saw General Nemesis pick up the win with a Thor team. And he did play in the final round against a Godcatcher team perfected by none other than Shadow Meld, and barely squeaked out a win in that series. So that brings us to the here and now. 1 month later, 1 month removed from that previous tournament, what does the meta look like after the results from that second one? Well, let's take a look at the results of this tournament. So as I mentioned, in the Roll for the North, there were 30 players and 30 different teams across the tournament. And we're going to start by taking a look at the cards that were most often included on teams. And the list actually starts off with a brand new Infinity Gauntlet card, Spider-Man Public Menace, a rare with a really interesting spin down mechanic when he attacks, and this was brought by 13 different players, 13 different teams. The next 2 most brought cards were Clayface Restless and the win condition, the Godcatcher, famous walking statue, and both were brought 12 times. And the Godcatcher here was the most brought win condition card across the entire tournament. So as we've seen over the summer months and into here where we are in September, we've seen the Godcatcher go from being a 2nd tier win condition right below the S tier of Becky Lynch Maiden Ireland to the most brought win condition, tier 1 win condition of tournament play here in Roll for the North. Interestingly enough, we also had 11 players bring Becky Lynch Made in Ireland, as well as 11 players bring Thor Jormungandr's Fear, the super rare from the Infinity Gauntlet set. So the two other win conditions that are very popular, and some would argue are both tier 1, were brought at nearly the exact same rate as the God Catcher. I will pause here and mention though that 2 players did bring Becky Lynch Straight Fire, which could also lump into the Becky Lynch Made in Ireland numbers, technically making Becky Lynch the more brought win condition than the God Catcher. But it is important to note that some people most likely brought Becky Lynch just to use for the global and as a possible pivot just in case their first win condition got shut down. Other often brought cards include the new rare Typhoid Mary that essentially acts like the Shriek that just rotated, Villainous Pact in the basic action slot, most likely for the prep global, but also could be used to actually purchase since villains are pretty weak right now in the meta. Black Widow Widow's Hunt, another brand new Infinity Gauntlet card that adds a little bit of control, and the Collector Stolen Cosmic Cube. Typhoid Mary was brought 10 times, Villainous Pact was brought 9, Black Widow and Collector were each brought 8 times. Also brought 8 times was Drax the Pacifist, the rare Drax that everyone's really excited about from the Infinity Gauntlet set, as well as Eddie Guerrero Ice Steel. Now across all 30 teams, we only saw 7 instances of Static Field brought, which is actually the exact same number of people that brought Nefarious Broadcast, a very powerful basic action card that only costs 2, that can essentially turn off Static Field. Finally, and I'm going to point this card out very specifically, Atlantis, City and Stronghold was only brought by 6 players, but it's important to remember that number. 6 players brought Atlantis, City and Stronghold, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. And I hate to leave out a bunch of other really interesting cards that popped up on one team or another, but if I talked about literally every card that interested me, we'd be here for a lot longer than I planned for us to be. So let's cut to the chase and let's take a look at some of the top teams to really kind of get an understanding of what this meta looks like right now. Now with the way that ties were working within this tournament, we're actually going to do something a little bit different rather than just looking at like the top 8. There's 2 ways we could break this down. We could look at the top 7 teams, which would include every team that either won 3 or 4 games and only lost 1 game, or we can look at the top 12 teams, which includes every team that won 3 games, and everybody within this bracket either lost no games, 1 game, or 2 games. We're going to do the latter. We're going to look at the top 12 teams of this tournament, which is kind of a large sample size when we really slim things down, but this is a list of teams that were 3-2 or better. So 3 wins, 2 losses, or better. And this comprises about 40% of the tournament teams themselves. So like I said, kind of large, but I want to do this for a very specific reason, and we'll talk about that as we look at the 12th place team. The 12th place team was run by CCM Quadruple 07, and he ran a flying sidekick team that included Atlantis Wealthy Kingdom to draw 2 dice every time you field a sidekick character die, and Black Widow to buff all of your sidekicks by +1 attack every time she's fielded. He also included Plague Marine, Vectors of Death and Disease, as well as Supreme Intelligence, and Spider-Man Public Menace, just because Spider-Man's amazing, perhaps. As you can see, he also has the Collector on there, which is absolutely wonderful for triggering Atlantis and getting the ball rolling, and interestingly enough, he also includes Crowd Fighting, a card that I'm not sure has actually ever seen play at any point. Anger Issues, Eddie Guerrero, and Drax the Pacifist round out that team, and keep in mind, this is in the top 40%. He made 12th place with this team with a 3-2 record, and believe it or not, the next 4 teams after it also had a 3-2 record. And because these next 4 teams also have a 3-2 record, this is why I decided to include these within our slimmed down breakdown. In 11th place, we had Stu Art with a Becky Lynch Made in Ireland team and a bunch of interesting other pieces. Instead of running the traditional Booker T. Jerry Lawler global combo in your basic action slot, we see Booker T and anger issues. We also see Kurt Angle intensity on here. I'm not sure if he brought this for the global or actually to use the ability, but the ability is very interesting in and of itself. We see another popular piece in Spider-Man Public Menace, and we see a Godcatcher control piece in the form of Gazer Evil Familiar. Keep your eye on that one. We're going to see it again in this top cut. Istrid Horn is here to shut off globals, and Kree Captain's here to help you buy Becky Lynch or maybe Kurt Angle. We can presume that the Great Drunkard is on here to prevent just giant things from coming your way, even though I'm not really sold on how well that actually works. And this is our first instance of seeing Atlantis, City, and Stronghold on here, most likely for the global on any team that we see it on, but you can actually purchase this and use the effect. It's generally a very beneficial effect. But again, remember that we see this for the first time here. I wonder how many more times we will see this within the top cut. 10th place is where we encounter our first Godcatcher team, and this one was piloted by none other than Shadowmeld himself, and this was his Godcatcher team that he ran in the previous UK Games Expo tournament to great effect. It's got the Godcatcher as well as Scott Hall for the wonderful Force Attack global. That global is highly underrated and should be run on far more teams. He also has Hawkeye, Taking Aim, which has another wonderful global for Godcatcher teams because it allows you to ping off sidekick character dice that your opponent may try to field and prevent you from attacking and pushing through with Godcatchers. This is our second occurrence of seeing Atlantis, City, and Stronghold for the global, which does thin your bag by fielding a sidekick and putting a sidekick from your used into prep. And we have Thor Jormungandr Sphere on here, both as a way to buy Godcatcher easier because you can pay a bolt for the global and then pay a bolt for Godcatcher and buy it for 2 essentially, but you can also pivot to this as a secondary win condition. Supreme Intelligence is insane for just prepping over 2-cost basic actions like Nefarious Broadcast, which is extremely good on this team. You could literally just buy Nefarious Broadcast and Godcatchers and win the game just with those cards and dice alone. Clayface is on here because it's insane, especially when you have all of these bolt globals and just general synergies around getting your Godcatchers out quickly and then killing your opponent. Storm is the most interesting addition to this team. I'd say it's even more interesting than Hawkeye because of the fact that it is a Clayface target, allowing you to get bolts out of your used pile. And Villainous Pact is on here obviously for the prep global, but you could also technically buy this and then just make it really hard for your opponent to block your Godcatchers. It's interesting because a lot of people would take that slot and put on Under Surveillance and just run this as an unblockable Godcatcher team, but doing so would defeat the purpose of Scott Hall and Hawkeye. So this is definitely a different take on Godcatchers and one that is very successful, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But I do want to say that this team was highlighted in a great deep dive by the DM United crew, so I want to point you over to that video if you want more details on this team. I will say this is not the last time we'll see this team essentially on this list because it almost verbatim was run by another player. 9th place presents us with another what might be considered off-meta team, though it did finish 9th place, so it makes you question, is this off-meta or is this just something that could have some legs in the meta? This is a Doctor Strange Moon Knight Create Bonfire team, with the idea that you're going to use Moon Knight to copy Doctor Strange's ability, get your Moon Knight out, and start using Create Bonfire to deal damage and double the effect with Moon Knight present. It's got Kree Captain to help you buy big things like Doctor Strange if you wanted to triple the effect, or Moon Knight, or Thor. Thor's on here to help you buy Create Bonfire. Obviously, because this is a burn team, we have the Static Field Global, and pairing nicely with the Static Field Global is Spider-Man Public Menace. Typhoid Mary for the blanking effect is on here, and we do have Intellect Devourer and Clayface for fixing and pulling out dice and just general goodness. This is a really interesting team and one that I'm going to ask Jason a little bit more about and try to get more information on how his matchups went, because finishing 9th place with a team that no one really ever saw coming is an impressive feat in and of itself. In 8th place, we have Heavy Metal Monkey's Godcatcher team that features the Godcatcher alongside of Yawning Portal and Under Surveillance. He also runs Throne Brick in here, and interestingly enough, he's got Forge so that he can buy all of these actions for cheaper. Now, this is an instance where he does have Becky Lynch, but he doesn't have any of the big Becky Lynch doubling or force block globals, so we're going to assume that Becky Lynch is really more of a pivot piece and not a primary win condition. And of course, because of that, it is going to drive down the idea that this really populist Becky Lynch meta is a little bit less so because of the utility of the global for some teams. Gazer, Evil Familiar, is obviously here for the Godcatcher versus Godcatcher meta, and Eddie Guerrero Eye Steel is just generally good to stop people from pushing your Godcatchers back. We also see Thor, obviously, for the global. He ran the common Thor that doesn't have any text, and that obviously just shows us that this is here for the global, and we have Drax for some general control. So those are teams 12 through 8, and I included those because they are all 3 wins and 2 losses, and technically they're all, because of the record, sort of tied for that 8th place slot, even though obviously the ties were broken by some tiebreaker metrics created by the challenge system the tournament was run through. It's also important to note that within those 5 teams, we did see some what we would consider off-meta teams that didn't run those big 3 win conditions. And it's always important to try and find a few of those that did perform well and try to see if those could possibly have some legs going further. Okay, so now on to the top 7, which really comprises about 24% of this bracket, and this is what we can consider the top 24% of the bracket. In 7th place, we have Epicat's Godcatcher team, and this is a Godcatcher team that really tries to push unblockable Godcatchers using under surveillance, but we do see Nefarious Broadcast on here as well. This one features a lot of the same pieces that we've seen with regards to Drax the Pacifist and Spider-Man Public Menace, Gazer Evil Familiar, and Thor Jormungandr Sphere as a nice little pivot, as well as just being able to use that global. Intellect Devourer is on here to be able to fix to whatever you want, and we have the combo of Atlas, which is the first time we've seen this in the top 12, for the global, and Professor X for the Pay the Mask global and Prep 2 sidekicks. Epicat finished with 3 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie on the day. Also finishing with 3 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie is Andy and Richfield at 6th place. Andy also ran a Godcatcher team focusing on using under surveillance to make unblockable Godcatchers, though he does lean into the super rare Thor as a pivot win condition, and maybe even ran this as one of the primary win conditions depending on the matchup, and we can assume this is the case because he includes Ghost Rider Hellfire, a 3-drop bolt common from the Infinity Gauntlet set that combos wonderfully with the Thor. It says when fielded, deal your opponent X damage, where X is equal to Ghost Rider's printed fielding cost. And this combo was something I actually featured in a previous combo breakdown video, so I'm really excited to see this make a splash in a top level tournament. We can also kind of assume that he's trying to buy Thor rather than just using the global, because he does include Walk with Elias for the global. Yawning Portal also helps you reduce the purchase cost of character dice that you might want to go and grab, as well as using that alongside of the Collector Global, because you can just field a sidekick and reduce everything by 1. Yellow Lantern Ring, the Weaponer's Ring, is incredibly powerful against the Godcatcher, so he has that on here to, I guess, tech against other Godcatcher teams. Eddie Guerrero Eye Steel is just generally good to stop people from pushing your Godcatchers back, as I've mentioned before. And Becky Lynch is presumably on here for the global, though you could actually just go and buy Becky Lynch like you could the Thor. Some really interesting pieces on this one. I like it a lot. In 5th place, we finally find our first straight-up Becky Lynch team using Becky Lynch, Made in Ireland, Booker T for the Force Block Global, and Jerry Lawler for the Doubling the Attack Global. And this was run by Peter Van de Velde, who, in previous tournaments that we've mentioned before, was running a variant on Iceman. So it's interesting to see him sort of pivot into this Becky Lynch, Made in Ireland team. On this team, we do see some similar pieces as before, like the Gazer and the Spider-Man. We also see the Istrid Horn and even a Godcatcher on here as well. A couple of interesting things to note. Here we see another inclusion of Atlantis. I think this makes our 3rd within the top 12. And remember, it was only brought 6 times. We also see Grell, which is the first time we've seen Grell show up in the top 12. It's great against the Godcatcher with that deadly keyword. And we see Deadpool Weir X-Force, which can give itself Overcrush if it gets blocked, as well as just having a generally beneficial fist global that says pay a fist, deal 2 damage to target blocking character die. Essentially, you can pay this fist on the character that blocks Becky Lynch and guarantee that your Becky Lynch is going to push more damage through when it deals its Overcrush. On to the top 4 we go, and in 4th place we have a Thor team run by General Nemesis, the winner of the UK Games Expo Dice Masters tournament. He's running a Thor list like he did in that tournament, and on this we see Kree Captain in here along with Clayface so you can buy Thor quickly. We also see Atlas alongside of that so you can prep it and then hopefully roll it on turn 3. Static Field and Confront the Mighty are the basic action slots. Confront the Mighty is great for dealing with God Catchers by using Confront the Mighty on your sidekick and their God Catcher to KO both of them, removing the God Catcher forever. The Collector and Intellect Devourer work together very well to allow you to just kind of manipulate your dice in such a way to buy whatever you need. Black Widow is a great piece to pull out of the used pile with Clayface and put onto 2 masks so you can use the Collector Global to do things. And Spider-Man here was the choice that he went with for control pieces. Obviously, it's very good with Static Field because you can attack with it and then Static Field it back, removing a character die from your opponent's side. In third place, we have a really interesting God Catcher Becky Lynch team run by Elliot2M, a really strong up-and-coming player. This one uses the 4-cost Becky Lynch Straight Fire that has Overcrush, but also has that wonderful global, as well as the 3-cost God Catcher that is so popular within this tournament. As far as tools for each of them to succeed, he did bring Booker T to force block and Nefarious Broadcast to prevent pushbacks and just really preventing a lot of different globals. Forge here allows him to purchase things like the God Catcher and the Yellow Lantern Ring for cheap. Spider-Man makes the appearance again here, and we do see Atlantis City and Stronghold yet again. Grell here makes the cut to combat God Catchers for your opponent, and Danny Moonstar appears, which is the first time we've seen Danny Moonstar within any of the teams in the top 12. This is a card that's been maligned by a lot of people for just not making sense in the current meta or just not being very strong, and yet here it is in third place on a third place team. And with that, we are down to the top 2 teams, and in second place we have James Blore of the DM United crew, the leader of the DM United crew, I should say, running a very similar looking list to the one that Shadowmeld ran. In fact, they both ran virtually the same list except for one slight tweak. Instead of the 2-cost Bolt Storm, we have the 2-cost Bolt Grell. Again, since I broke this team down already when talking about the 10th place Shadowmeld team, and because they did such a good job of talking about this team at length on their own video, I'm going to once again point you to their video. You should really check it out. I highly recommend it. And that leaves just one player on top of them all. One player in first place with a record of 4-0-1. The current world champion himself, Ben Saeed Scott, running a straight-up Becky Lynch Made in Ireland team featuring Booker T and Jerry Lawler to push a whole bunch of damage. Outside of the win condition, we again see Atlantis City and Stronghold make its appearance. This global is insane. I pointed this out towards the beginning of the video for you to keep your eye on this. Look how many times it's appeared in the top 12 of the tournament. We also see Drax the Pacifist and Typhoid Mary making the cut onto the team, but most interesting to me is the inclusion of both Eddie Guerrero and Istrid Horn onto the team, alongside of Gazer Evil Familiar. Danny Moonstar rounds out the team, and that's not surprising to me in the slightest. One, because I actually do think this card is very strong in general, and two, I know Ben loves that card. I will be honest, I was shocked when I saw this team originally, because when I first sat down to build a Becky Lynch, Jerry Lawler, Booker T team, I also included both Eddie Guerrero, Gazer, and Istrid Horn, as well as Atlantis, to go alongside of Becky and her two counterparts. When playing this team myself, I got some strange looks from my opponents and some questions as to why I included both Eddie and Istrid Horn, and I'm sure Ben has had that exact same experience. But I do think that this is one of those times where you're basically just selling out to winning with Becky Lynch. There is no pivoting. There is no playing around with some other possible shift. This is, I'm going to win with Becky Lynch. And if you do this, then I'll buy Eddie. And if you do that, then I'll buy Istrid. And if you do that, then I'll buy Gazer. But my number one condition for winning the game is winning with Becky Lynch. Everything else is subject to allowing you to do that. And it clearly worked well for the world champion because he ended the day with 4 wins, 0 losses, and a single tie. His tie came in the final round against General Nemesis and his Thor team, both players winning a single game off of the other. Though I'm sure it's not nearly as simple as that. So those were the top 12 teams of the tournament. And after looking at all of those, what have we learned through this long video? Well, as far as win conditions are concerned, there are now 3 pretty viable win conditions in the meta. Becky Lynch, Godcatcher, and Thor are all very strong in their own right. And while we don't necessarily have a paper, rock, scissors type meta, it does appear that these 3 meta pieces are fairly evenly matched, meaning that games will favor the better prepared. What other takeaways can we take from this? Well, out of the 6 players that brought Atlantis, City, and Stronghold to the entire tournament of all 30 players and 30 teams, all of those players ended up in the top 12 teams. And 4 of those 6 players ended up in the top 24% of teams, finishing in one of the first 7 spots. Is this just some weird fluke from one single tournament? That is a real possibility. Or is this a sign that that card and that global specifically is just really, really good? Keep that in mind as we go into the spoiler season for Dark Phoenix, as it may not be the last time we see a global, kind of like it. And finally, out of the top 12 teams of the tournament, we did see 4 of them running Nefarious Broadcast, a really powerful shutdown card for globals. If you plan to build meta teams, this is officially a card you really need to watch out for. So there you go, there you have it. That's a really deep dive into this tournament and the general meta of modern age Dice Masters. What did you think about this breakdown? Do you enjoy seeing this meta breakdown in general? And would you like to see more of it? Is there anything that I missed or got totally wrong? Let me know in a comment below. If you enjoyed this, consider liking and subscribing like I said before, and as always everybody, thanks for watching.